My daughter grabbed my purse and said, "This is mine now." I closed the bank account. The moment my daughter grabbed my purse from the kitchen table and calmly said, "This is mine now," something inside me cracked in a way I never expected. It was not about the leather bag or the bank card inside. It was the quiet certainty in her voice, as if my life, my choices, and everything I had built over decades could suddenly be taken away. I stood there realizing that the person I once protected as a child was now preparing to take control of the life I had spent years building. That was the moment I understood I had only two choices: surrender quietly or fight for my independence. Before we dive into today's story, take a moment to share where you're tuning in from. We love seeing how our stories connect people from all around the world. Your comments and thoughts bring this community to life, and we're so grateful to have you on this journey with us. If you haven't already, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. Now, grab a cozy seat, maybe a cup of coffee or tea, and prepare yourself for a tale that will captivate your heart from beginning to end. Let's begin. My name is Eleanor Whitaker. I am 72 years old, and for the past 3 years, I have lived alone in a wooden house that sits quietly above Lake Geneva in the state of Wisconsin. When people imagine living alone at my age, they often picture something fragile or lonely. My life is neither of those things. It is quiet, yes, but it is also steady, familiar, and built on habits that have carried me through most of my life. The house itself is not large by modern standards, but it feels big when the wind moves through the trees and the lake stretches wide in front of the porch. My husband Robert and I bought this place more than 35 years ago, when the wood siding was dull and the roof leaked in two places. Robert believed that anything worth having could be repaired slowly with patient hands. Over the years, he replaced boards, fixed windows, and rebuilt the back steps one summer afternoon at a time. Robert worked as a mechanic in a small boat repair shop down near the marina. His hands always smelled faintly of engine oil, even after he washed them. He was not a man who spoke loudly about his accomplishments, but everything he did carried the quiet confidence of someone who understood how things worked. The house grew stronger with each repair he made. In many ways, so did our life. Robert died 3 years ago after a short illness. The quiet that followed his absence felt heavy at first, but eventually it settled into something gentler. I kept the routines that had always anchored our days. I wake early each morning, make coffee in the kitchen, and carry the mug out to the porch where the lake reflects whatever color the sky has decided to wear that day. Most mornings the water looks silver, rippling softly against the shore. On calm days, it becomes a smooth sheet of pale blue. I sit in the old wooden chair Robert built and watch the town wake up slowly across the water. I still drive my old Ford into town twice a week. The library stands beside a bakery that always smells like cinnamon and fresh bread. The grocery store clerk knows my name and asks about the weather, as if it were a personal project we were all working on together. Small towns carry a rhythm that does not hurry anyone along. My daughter Claire lives in Chicago with her husband and their 2 children. The city has shaped her life in ways that are very different from mine. She moves quickly, speaks quickly, and believes that every problem has a solution if someone organizes it properly. Over the past year, Claire has begun suggesting that I simplify things. She says the house is too large for one person and that maintaining property by the lake can be difficult for someone my age. At first, I heard only concern in her voice. Children worry about their parents as time moves forward. That is a natural turning of the seasons. But the conversations have changed slowly. Claire now asks more questions about my bills and my accounts. She wonders whether I sometimes forget passwords or payment dates. Her words are careful, but beneath them I hear something else. Something that feels less like concern and more like planning. A few days ago, I returned from town and placed my purse on the kitchen table beside a stack of grocery receipts. It is an old leather purse that Robert gave me many years ago. The corners are worn smooth, and the zipper makes a soft metal sound when it closes. Inside it are ordinary things: my bank card, a few folded receipts, a photograph of my grandson Lucas standing beside his first car. I remember looking at that purse resting quietly on the table and thinking how small objects sometimes carry more meaning than people expect. At the time, the house was peaceful and the afternoon light was warm across the kitchen floor. I did not yet know that within a few days, my daughter would walk through that door, pick up that purse, and say something that would change everything. If you're still watching, and this moment made you curious about what really happened next, comment number 1 below so I know you're here with me. Now let's move forward and see what happened the moment that purse left the table. The morning began like most mornings in my house beside Lake Geneva. The air carried that cool softness that comes from water before the sun climbs too high, and the kitchen windows were open just enough to let the breeze move the curtains. I stood at the counter grinding coffee beans, listening to the familiar hum of the machine and the distant sound of a boat engine somewhere out on the lake. There was nothing unusual about the day. My grocery list sat beside the sink, and I planned to drive into town later to pick up bread and a few things for the garden. The quiet rhythm of the house felt steady, the same quiet that had wrapped around me ever since Robert passed away. The phone call from Claire the night before had left a small disturbance in that rhythm. She had sounded rushed, speaking faster than usual, asking questions that did not quite fit the conversation. She wanted to know if I still paid my electric bill online. She asked whether I remembered my bank passwords and whether I had ever thought about automatic payments. At the time, I had answered calmly, though something about the question stayed with me after we hung up. Claire had never shown much interest in my day-to-day finances before. The change in tone lingered in my thoughts as I poured hot water over the coffee grounds. A car door closed outside. The sound echoed through the still morning air in a way that made me pause. Visitors in our town usually call before arriving, and the gravel driveway tends to announce strangers with a long crunch of tires. I walked toward the living room window and saw Claire's car parked beside the porch steps. She stepped out quickly, already holding her phone against her ear as if finishing a conversation. Her movements carried the same hurried energy she always brought with her from Chicago. When she pushed open the front door, she did not knock. "Morning," she said, her voice distracted as she slipped the phone into her bag. I noticed the faint scent of expensive perfume following her into the kitchen. Claire glanced around the room as if measuring it with her eyes, taking in the counters, the cabinets, the small stack of mail near the toaster. Her attention stopped on the kitchen table. My purse sat exactly where I had left it the day before, the brown leather catching a narrow stripe of sunlight from the window. Claire walked over and picked it up without hesitation. For a moment, she turned it in her hands, studying the worn edges and the small scratches near the clasp. Then she opened it and looked inside. I remained near the counter, watching quietly. She reached into the purse and pulled out my bank card. "This is mine now," she said. The words were calm, almost practical, as if she were explaining a simple household change. Claire slipped the card into her own bag and closed the purse. Her expression carried the kind of certainty that does not leave space for discussion. "You should not have to worry about money anymore," she continued. "I can take care of everything from here." She spoke about convenience, about making things easier. According to her plan, we would visit the bank later that afternoon and organize the account so she could manage payments and expenses. While she talked, I noticed the way she moved through the kitchen, straightening a stack of envelopes and glancing at the refrigerator calendar as if the house already belonged to her. I did not argue. Sometimes the clearest way to understand someone's intentions is to let them show you exactly what they believe they are entitled to do. Claire picked up her bag and walked toward the door. The purse remained tucked beneath her arm. "I will come back around 3, she said before stepping outside. The front door closed behind her with a quiet click. The house felt different after she left. I stood at the kitchen table, looking at the empty spot where the purse had been resting only minutes earlier. The sunlight still fell across the wood in the same gentle stripe, but something about the room had shifted. It was not confusion I felt. It was recognition. Something important had just begun. If you're still watching and wondering what someone would do after their own daughter took control like that, comment number 2 below to let me know you're with me. Now, let's move on and see the first move that changed everything. For several minutes after Claire left, I remained standing in the kitchen. The room had not changed. The same light rested across the table, and the same quiet breeze moved the curtains near the window. Yet something inside the house felt different, as if a line had been crossed so quietly that only I had heard it. The empty space where my purse had been resting drew my attention again and again. It was a small object, nothing extraordinary, but it had carried pieces of my daily life. Receipts from the grocery store, a photograph of Lucas smiling beside his first car, the bank card I had used for years without a second thought. Claire had taken it as if it were already hers. I poured myself another cup of coffee and sat down at the table. The warmth of the mug steadied my hands. Over the years, I had learned that anger rarely improves a situation. When Robert and I faced problems, he always said that the first step was to understand what was happening before deciding what to do next. So I replayed the morning in my mind. Claire had not asked permission. She had not suggested a change or offered help. She had acted with the calm certainty of someone who believed she already had the right to decide. That realization settled into me slowly. If I did nothing, she would return later that afternoon and expect the rest of my life to follow the plan she had already imagined. I set the mug down and reached for the phone mounted on the kitchen wall. The number for our local bank had been written beside it for years. Robert and I had opened that account together more than 3 decades ago. When the line connected, a familiar voice answered, "Good morning, Mrs. Whitaker." I introduced myself and explained that I needed to place a temporary hold on my account until I could visit the branch in person. My tone remained steady, the way one speaks when handling an ordinary matter. The employee paused only long enough to confirm my identity. Then she assured me the request could be noted immediately. After I hung up, the house seemed to breathe again. I gathered my coat from the hallway closet and took the small envelope where I kept my driver license and other identification. The routine movements felt reassuring, like stepping back into a role I had filled for most of my adult life. The drive into town followed the familiar road along the edge of the lake. The water stretched wide and pale beneath the morning sky. As I passed the marina, I thought about the years Robert spent repairing engines for the fishermen who docked there. A few blocks later, the road curved past the diner where he used to stop for breakfast before work. The buildings had not changed much over time. Our town moved slowly, which was one of the reasons we had chosen to stay. The bank stood near the center of town beside the post office. When I walked through the glass doors, the quiet hum of printers and low conversations filled the room. The branch manager, a man named Harold Simmons, recognized me almost immediately. He had known Robert for years and greeted me with the respectful patience that small towns still offer to longtime customers. We sat in his office while he reviewed my account history on the computer. A moment later, his eyebrows lifted slightly. "There was a withdrawal earlier this morning," he said carefully. The number appeared on the screen, $1,200. I nodded once. That would have been my daughter. There was no anger in my voice, only confirmation. I asked him to freeze the account immediately and to explain the process of closing it and opening a new one under my name alone. Harold listened without interruption and began preparing the necessary forms. Within an hour, the paperwork was complete. When I stepped back outside, the afternoon sun reflected brightly across the lake. Claire believed she had already taken control. What she did not know was that the first move had already been made. If you're still watching and you want to know whether the situation stopped there or grew even more complicated, comment number 3 below so I know you're following the story. Now, let's move forward to the next chapter where the truth begins to surface. When I stepped outside the bank, the afternoon sun had already climbed higher in the sky. The street looked the same as it always did. A few cars moved slowly past the post office, and a pair of older men stood near the diner talking about the weather as if it were the most serious matter in the world. For a moment, I stood on the sidewalk, letting the quiet settle around me. Closing the account had felt like the right step. It was calm, practical, and necessary. Yet I knew it was only the beginning of something larger. Claire believed she had taken control of my finances. When she returned later that afternoon, expecting cooperation, she would discover the situation had changed. Instead of driving straight home, I walked down the main street. The bakery door was open, and the smell of fresh bread drifted onto the sidewalk. A few people sat near the window with coffee cups in front of them. The town carried on with its usual rhythm, unaware that the balance inside my family had shifted that morning. As I passed the hardware store Robert used to visit, I found myself thinking about Claire again. Her behavior earlier had not looked like simple concern. There had been urgency behind it, a kind of determination that felt almost rehearsed. The thought stayed with me long enough that I turned around and walked back toward the bank. Harold Simmons was still in his office when I returned. He looked slightly surprised to see me again, though his expression remained friendly. I wondered if I could ask one more question, I said. He invited me to sit down. I explained that Claire had been asking about my accounts recently, and I wanted to understand whether she had spoken with the bank before today. Harold leaned back slightly in his chair, considering his answer. She called a few times over the past month, he said carefully, mostly asking general questions about financial arrangements for older clients. The words were polite, but something in his tone suggested there was more. He hesitated before continuing. She also asked about the value of property in your area, specifically homes near the lake. The room grew quiet for a moment. I folded my hands together on the desk and waited. Harold cleared his throat gently. There has been some talk among lenders recently, he said. Your daughter and her husband may have experienced financial difficulty connected to a real estate investment in Chicago. The information settled slowly into place. Claire had never mentioned any serious problems. Our phone calls had remained ordinary, filled with small complaints about work and traffic. Yet the urgency in her voice the night before suddenly made more sense. If there were debts, the house by the lake would appear valuable. Selling it could solve many problems quickly. I felt no sudden anger, only a quiet understanding of the pressure that might lead someone to act the way Claire had that morning. Still, understanding did not mean surrender. Thank you for telling me, I said. Harold nodded, clearly relieved that the conversation had remained calm. Before leaving, I asked whether he knew a lawyer who handled estate planning, someone who understood how to protect property and savings. He reached into a drawer and handed me a small card with a name and an address in Madison. The drive home followed the familiar road beside the water. Sunlight moved across the surface of the lake in wide bands of silver. For years, that house had been simply the place where Robert and I lived our lives. Now I realized it had become something else in Claire's eyes. A solution. As I pulled into the driveway, I understood that protecting the bank account had only been the first step. If Claire believed the house could rescue her from trouble, she would not stop easily. And that meant I needed to think several steps ahead. If you're still watching and starting to sense that there may be more behind these actions than anyone expected, comment number 4 below to show you're still with the story. Now let's continue and see how the tension begins to rise. 2 days passed after my visit to the bank, and life around the house beside Lake Geneva appeared to return to its usual rhythm. The morning still began with coffee on the porch and the quiet movement of water across the surface of the lake. The garden behind the house needed attention, and I spent part of the afternoon trimming the lavender bushes Robert had planted years ago. Yet beneath the calm routine, something had shifted. I found myself paying closer attention to small things: the sound of cars passing the driveway, the way the mailbox door closed after the morning delivery, even the tone of voices when neighbors stopped to talk across the fence. The first sign came from Mrs. Donnelly, who lived 2 houses down the road. She waved to me while walking her dog and asked a question that felt slightly unusual. She wondered whether I had been feeling well lately. The concern in her voice was gentle, but it lingered after she continued down the street. Mrs. Donnelly had known me for nearly 15 years. In all that time, she had never asked anything quite like that before. Later that same afternoon, I drove into town to pick up groceries. While standing in line at the market, the cashier glanced at me with the same careful expression. "Your daughter was here earlier this week," she said. I nodded without thinking much of it. "She mentioned you might be having trouble keeping track of things." The sentence was delivered politely, as if the cashier believed she was sharing helpful information, but the words settled into my mind with a quiet weight. I finished paying and walked out to the parking lot slowly. The warm air carried the scent of cut grass from somewhere down the road, yet my thoughts were no longer on the errands I had planned. Claire had been speaking to people. At first, the idea seemed almost harmless. Children sometimes worry about their parents as they grow older. It would not be unusual for her to mention concerns in passing. But as the day continued, more small pieces began to fall into place. That evening, I received a call from my doctor's office reminding me about a routine appointment scheduled for the following month. During the conversation, the receptionist mentioned that Claire had contacted them recently to ask whether I had shown any signs of memory problems. The pattern was now clear. Claire was not simply expressing concern to family members. She was planting the same suggestion in several places at once, the suggestion that I might not be fully capable of managing my life. I sat at the kitchen table after dinner and let the realization settle slowly. If those conversations continued, they could create the impression that my independence was fading. Enough concern expressed in the right places could eventually lead someone to suggest legal supervision, guardianship. The word carried a very specific meaning in legal matters. If a court believed an elderly person could no longer manage finances or property safely, a guardian could be appointed to make those decisions instead. I did not need to guess who Claire would suggest for that role. The situation no longer looked like a disagreement between a mother and daughter. It looked like preparation. I opened the drawer beside the refrigerator and took out a small notebook Robert had once used for measuring lumber when he repaired the back porch. The pages were mostly empty. That evening I began writing. I recorded the date Claire came to the house and took the purse. I wrote down the amount withdrawn from the bank account and the time of my visit to the branch. I also noted the conversations with Mrs. Donnelly, the grocery clerk, and the doctor's office. Each detail mattered. Robert used to say that every mechanical problem leaves a trail if someone knows where to look. The same principle applied here. By the time the sun had disappeared behind the lake, several pages of the notebook were filled with careful handwriting. Claire believed she was building a case. What she did not realize was that I had begun building one of my own. The morning after I began writing in the notebook arrived quietly, as if the house itself understood that something important had changed. Pale light moved across the kitchen floor, and the lake outside reflected a soft gray sky that promised a warm afternoon later in the day. I sat at the kitchen table with the notebook open in front of me. The pages contained careful notes about the last few days, dates, times, conversations, and details that might seem small to someone else now formed a clear pattern when I looked at them together. Claire had not acted impulsively. She had been preparing. That realization settled in with surprising calm. Fear rarely helps when decisions must be made clearly. Instead, I remembered the way Robert approached problems in his workshop. When a boat engine failed, he never rushed to tighten the first bolt he saw. He studied the entire machine until he understood exactly where the trouble began. My situation required the same patience. The business card Harold Simmons had given me rested beside the notebook. The name printed on it belonged to Daniel Carter, an estate planning attorney whose office was located in Madison. I picked up the phone and called the number. A receptionist answered with a steady, professional tone. I explained that I wished to schedule a consultation regarding financial planning and property protection. Within a few minutes, an appointment was arranged for later that week. After the call ended, I closed the notebook and prepared to leave the house. The drive to Madison took a little over an hour. The road moved through long stretches of farmland, where rows of corn reached toward the sky and red barns stood quietly beside gravel driveways. It was the kind of landscape that encourages steady thinking. During the drive, I considered what I truly wanted from the meeting. This was not about punishing Claire or proving her wrong. Children sometimes make poor decisions when fear and pressure combine. What mattered was making sure no one could remove control of my life through legal arguments or quiet assumptions about age. The office building in Madison stood on a calm street lined with maple trees. Inside, the waiting room carried the faint smell of paper and polished wood. Daniel Carter greeted me with the kind of respectful attention that comes from long experience working with older clients. His manner was patient rather than rushed, which immediately reassured me. I explained the events of the past week. I told him about Claire taking the purse and the bank card, about the withdrawal from the account, and about the rumors suggesting that I might not be able to manage my affairs. Daniel listened carefully without interrupting. When I finished, he folded his hands and spoke calmly about the legal options available. The most effective protection, he explained, would be the creation of a living trust. Such a structure would place my financial assets and property into a formal arrangement where I remained the active decision maker. As long as I was capable, every choice would still belong to me. The trust would also clearly establish who would receive those assets in the future. I told him that my grandson Lucas should be the beneficiary. Lucas had never shown the slightest interest in my finances. He visited simply to spend time together, which made the decision feel natural. Daniel also suggested recording a video statement confirming my ability to make these decisions independently. The recording would document my intentions and demonstrate that I understood every step being taken. I agreed to each recommendation. The documents were prepared, and I signed the first pages while sitting at the conference table. The act of writing my name felt simple, yet it carried a quiet strength. When I stepped back outside the building, the afternoon sun had warmed the air, and the streets were bright with movement. Claire believed she was building a legal path toward control. What she did not yet understand was that the ground beneath that path had already begun to shift. If you're still watching and wondering how the daughter will react once she discovers what has already been done, comment number 6 below, so I know you're still here. Now let's move on to Chapter 7, where everything begins to shift. Several days passed after my visit to Madison. The house beside Lake Geneva returned to its quiet rhythm, and I allowed myself to move through the familiar routines that had shaped my life for years. Morning coffee on the porch, a slow walk through the garden, the careful watering of the hydrangeas Robert had planted along the back fence. From the outside, nothing appeared different. Yet beneath the calm surface, I felt a new steadiness. The meeting with Daniel Carter had placed important protections into motion. Papers were being prepared, signatures documented, and arrangements structured in ways that could not be undone by a single conversation or accusation. Preparation brings a certain kind of peace. I understood that Claire still believed she had the upper hand. She expected to return to the bank, reorganize the accounts, and continue the plan she had begun the morning she took my purse. In her mind, everything had already been decided, but plans sometimes collapse quietly. It was Harold Simmons who called to tell me what had happened. The phone rang late in the afternoon while I was standing in the kitchen slicing tomatoes from the garden. Harold's voice sounded careful but calm. He explained that Claire had come into the bank earlier that day. She had approached the counter confidently and asked to discuss my accounts. According to Harold, she spoke as though she were simply finalizing arrangements that had already been agreed upon. The employee assisting her had reviewed the account status on the computer. The freeze I requested several days earlier was clearly visible in the system. Claire had been informed that all activity on the account was suspended and that restructuring had already begun under my direct request. For a moment, I imagined the silence that must have followed those words. Harold did not describe Claire's reaction in detail, but he confirmed that she appeared surprised. She insisted that she was helping me organize my finances and that the bank must have misunderstood the situation. The employee responded politely, explaining that the account holder had personally issued the request and that no changes could be made without my presence. No funds were released. When Harold finished speaking, he assured me that the account remained secure and that the documentation we completed earlier was already moving through the proper channels. I thanked him and set the phone back on the kitchen counter. For a long moment, I simply stood there, listening to the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the distant call of birds near the lake. Claire had believed she was walking into the bank to confirm her authority. Instead, she had discovered that the ground beneath her plan had shifted. Later that evening, I received another piece of news. Daniel Carter's office had mailed a formal letter outlining the restructuring of my financial arrangements. The document made it clear that any attempt to claim legal control over my assets would be challenged immediately. The message was calm and professional, but its meaning was unmistakable. I carried my coffee out to the porch as the sun began to lower across the water. The lake reflected long bands of orange light stretching toward the shore. I did not feel triumph or satisfaction. What I felt instead was relief. For the first time since Claire walked into my kitchen and took that purse, the situation no longer felt as though it was slipping beyond my reach. The balance had begun to change. The days following Claire's visit to the bank moved slowly, as if the house itself were waiting for the next development. From the outside, my life appeared unchanged. I continued tending the garden behind the house and keeping the rooms in order the way Robert and I always had. But a quiet tension lingered beneath those routines. Claire had discovered that the account was frozen. By now, she would have received a letter from Daniel Carter's office explaining that my financial arrangements were being formally restructured. I knew my daughter well enough to understand that news like that would not sit comfortably with her. Still, the phone remained silent. 3 days after Harold's call, a familiar car turned into the driveway late in the afternoon. When I stepped onto the porch, I saw Lucas climbing out with a paper grocery bag in one arm. Lucas had always moved through life with a kind of thoughtful patience that reminded me of his grandfather. At 22, he was tall and slightly awkward in the way young men sometimes are, but his presence carried an easy kindness. He greeted me with a quick hug and held up the bag. "I brought bread from that bakery near my apartment," he said. The warmth in his voice filled the porch with a sense of normalcy that had been missing in recent days. We carried the groceries into the kitchen and spent a while preparing a simple meal together. Lucas sliced vegetables while I heated soup on the stove. The small routine created the kind of quiet comfort that family meals often bring. For a time, we spoke about ordinary things: his classes, the part-time job he had started, and the stubborn old car he was trying to keep running. Eventually, his expression grew more serious. "There is something Mom asked me about," he said carefully. I waited. Lucas explained that Claire had recently been asking him several questions about my memory and daily habits. She wondered whether I seemed forgetful during his visits. She asked whether I had ever misplaced bills or become confused about appointments. The questions had unsettled him. I did not know what to say, he admitted. It did not feel right. I nodded slowly. The moment had arrived sooner than I expected, yet it felt necessary. I told Lucas everything that had happened. I described Claire taking the purse from the kitchen table and removing the bank card as if it already belonged to her. I explained the withdrawal from the account and the rumors spreading through town suggesting that I might not be capable of managing my own affairs. I also told him about the steps I had taken: the meeting with Harold at the bank, the visit to Daniel Carter in Madison, the trust that was now being prepared to protect my property and savings. Lucas listened without interrupting. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and exhaled slowly. "I knew something was wrong," he said. There was no anger in his voice, only disappointment. What mattered most to him was not the money or the legal arrangements. He simply wanted to be certain that I was safe and able to live the life I had chosen. He promised that if anyone ever asked him about my independence, he would answer honestly. That promise meant more than he probably realized. Later, after Lucas drove away, I stood by the kitchen window watching the last light fade across the lake. The water had turned a deep shade of blue beneath the evening sky. For weeks, I had been carrying this conflict alone. Now, at least one person in the family understood the truth. If you're still watching and curious about how this family conflict will finally end, comment number 8 below to let me know you're ready for the conclusion. Now let's move forward and discover the final outcome of this story. Several quiet days passed after Lucas's visit. Autumn had begun to settle gently around the lake, and the air carried a cooler edge in the mornings. I continued with my usual routines, trimming the last of the summer flowers and stacking a small pile of firewood beside the porch. Life looked ordinary again, but I knew the calm would not last forever. Claire had received the letter from Daniel Carter's office by now. She knew the accounts had been reorganized and that the legal arrangements were already moving forward. For someone used to controlling situations, that realization could not have been easy. The afternoon she returned arrived without warning. I was standing at the kitchen counter rinsing a bowl when I heard a car pull into the driveway. The sound of gravel shifting beneath tires carried through the open window. When I stepped onto the porch, Claire was already walking toward the front door. She moved more slowly than usual. There was no phone pressed against her ear, no hurried steps or impatient gestures. Instead, she held something in both hands. My purse. The same brown leather purse she had taken from the kitchen table days earlier. She entered the house quietly and placed it on the table where it had been before everything changed. The worn leather looked almost unfamiliar after its short absence. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Claire stood beside the table, her shoulders slightly tense. The confidence she carried during her first visit had faded, replaced by something closer to uncertainty. "I should not have done that," she said finally. Her voice was steady but lower than usual. She explained that the financial trouble she and her husband faced had created a kind of pressure she had not expected. Their investment in Chicago had failed, and the debt surrounding it had grown faster than they anticipated. Fear had pushed her into decisions she convinced herself were reasonable. Taking control of my finances had seemed like a practical solution at the time. I listened without interrupting. Understanding fear does not erase what someone chooses to do with it. Claire said she did not want our relationship to end in anger. She asked whether there was a way forward that did not involve constant arguments or lawyers. I took a moment before answering. If we move forward, I said quietly, it has to begin with respect. The conditions were simple. My finances would remain my responsibility. My home would remain my decision. If she wished to be part of my life again, those boundaries could not be crossed. Claire nodded slowly. She did not argue. When she left a short time later, the house returned to its familiar silence. I stood in the kitchen looking at the purse resting once again on the table. The same object that had started the conflict had come back to where it belonged. Trust, however, would take longer to return. A few days after Claire returned the purse, the house beside Lake Geneva felt quiet again, in a way that was familiar rather than tense. Morning light stretched across the porch boards, and the lake carried that steady silver color it often wore in early autumn. I sat in the chair Robert built years ago and wrapped my hands around a warm cup of coffee. The water moved slowly against the shore, and the town across the lake was just beginning to wake. A fisherman started the engine of his boat near the marina, and the sound drifted across the calm surface. Life had returned to its ordinary rhythm. Yet something inside me had changed. The events of the past weeks had forced me to look at my life in a clearer way than I had before. I had always believed that growing older meant gradually stepping back and allowing the next generation to take the lead. That idea sounds peaceful when people speak about it, but the truth is more complicated. Independence does not disappear simply because years have passed. Sometimes it must be defended. The purse Claire returned now rested on the top shelf of the hallway cabinet. Before placing it there, I slipped a small note inside. It was not meant as a warning or a punishment. It was simply a reminder. Respect begins with asking. Lucas visited again that weekend. He arrived with a loaf of bread from the same bakery he liked and stayed long enough to help me clear the last fallen leaves from the garden path. Our conversations were simple and easy, the way family moments are supposed to feel. Claire had called once since her visit. The conversation was short but calmer than any we had shared in weeks. There were no discussions about money or legal arrangements, only a few careful words about everyday life. Trust does not rebuild overnight. But boundaries, once understood, can create space where respect grows again. That evening, I stood on the porch watching the sunset fade across Lake Geneva. The sky slowly turned from gold to deep blue, and the first lights appeared in the houses along the far shore. Age had not taken my voice or my judgment. If anything, the years had given me the courage to draw a line and hold it steady. And in the quiet of that evening, that felt like enough. Some moments in life arrive quietly, yet they reveal truths that remain with us for years. Growing older does not mean surrendering the right to decide how we live, what we value, or where our boundaries stand. Time may soften our steps, but it can also sharpen our understanding of dignity, respect, and self-worth. Sometimes the most important victories are not loud or dramatic. They happen in calm choices, in steady decisions, and in the courage to protect the life that was built through decades of patience and work. When a person learns to draw a line and hold it with grace, peace often follows in ways that cannot be forced. Thank you for spending this time with the story. If it spoke to you in any way, feel free to share your thoughts in the comments below. Your experiences and perspectives matter. And if you enjoy thoughtful stories like this, consider following and subscribing for more journeys about resilience, dignity, and the quiet strength that grows with time.